Hello, this is Christopher Zampona, bringing you another podcast from Zampona PC. And this one is more specified at those that work in the law enforcement field and are employed by the federal government. There's been much talk today in the news about revealing identities of those that work for places such as ICE or other law enforcement uh, agencies. And this is not allowed specifically by federal law already. And those that are in these agencies, I urge you to view this video so you know your rights. First, under the Freedom of Information Act, there are exemptions 6, 7C, and 7F that permit law enforcement agencies to withhold personal identifiable information from those who are employed and who are working. The actual act is 5 U.S.C. 552 ABA, and these laws have been upheld. Specifically, the District of Columbia has upheld them in their case law as recently as 2021. I'm going to link at some point to a white paper that relates to this, so I'm not going to go through all of the case law that relates to supporting these propositions, but give some background. So, in addition to the District of Columbia laws, one thing that's specifically discussed is in these exemptions, there's a test that's done. So those of you that are wondering about the test, it's really one that relates to there being some type of threat or potential threat to the person who is potentially losing their right to privacy in their name. So this test is under 7C, which I discussed earlier, which has a specific description as there's a privacy interest at stake that must belong to the individual rather than the agency. And it's consistently been held by courts, specifically here in the District of Columbia, that an exemption protects the privacy interests of all persons mentioned in law enforcement records, absent a strong overriding public interest to that information. So I note that strong overriding, these are legal terms. They could be litigated. However, there must be some nexus or rationality to revealing the information about that person's name and identity. And I give this as an example that I know through my own practice where there's an incident that occurs. The general rule is you sue the entity, that is the city, or sometimes specifically the agency in the city, but still the city. You're not suing the individual because the law protects the individual as long as they're operating within their scope of employment. And even that is a little bit expandable. So the law doesn't provide for you to sue individuals directly anyways. So revealing their identities isn't going to assist even the potential person bringing the lawsuit. All that you really need to have is the information about where that person works. And then basically under a general agency rule, that person has bound the employer to the liability that they may have created. So this law does help, and as we've seen recently, there has been law enforcement that have been threatened unjustly related to carrying out their duties ordered to them by the agency itself. So in general, though, to be sure and to be certain, there isn't a blanket withholding that's allowed in general for employees under the exemption. However, it is allowed to occur with this test that is done, where there has to be some real threat or potential real threat to that person. So if those of you that are listening to this don't know what freedom of information laws relate to, it's when you file to get information from the federal government about anything, really, and in this case, the name of an individual working for the federal government. And the government generally has to comply. However, there is, as I said earlier, these exemptions in the Freedom of Information law that relate to federal law enforcement. So what I wanted this quick 5-minute discussion for you to take away from is that it's not true that you have a right to this information under the current federal law. So when those speak about getting information about individuals that are participating in law enforcement, that they don't like what they're doing, that isn't giving them the right to have their information. As I've said, the Freedom of Information Act exemptions protect the individual privacy interests. And specifically, as I've said earlier, this is done for many reasons, but one of them is about they're following an order, so it's not really their specific actions that are causing this instance to happen. So in any event, if you have any further questions about this, it isn't a one-size-fits-all rule. However, it is a rule, and it's been upheld by courts. So I want those that are working for federal law enforcement to know that my office, Zamponia PC, is willing to defend your rights in this matter. I do encourage those that need to have any kind of defense, and I think all law enforcement does today, to obtain that through the Fraternal Order of Police insurance policy. It's a great policy, and it lists certain lawyers. I am one of them that is covered under that. However, you can also contact me directly without them to speak about these type of issues. In many cases, as we've seen in the past, if there is any type of rioting or other instances related to law enforcement, they will try to pick out the individuals that were involved and specifically riot or protest at their homes. So this is a tragedy because, as I said earlier, they in many cases are just following orders. So it is in your best interest to not reveal any information, nor any agency to reveal information until there's a full investigation done. And if at that point there needs to be some information released, it should be then given to the public. However, that should not happen immediately, as it can create a sense of contagion in people's minds that things occurred that actually didn't happen. So again, if you wish to call me, my number at the office is 202-223-6635. I urge you to make a phone call. My webpage is zamponialaw.com. Thank you again for this time, and good luck.